All right, hi everyone, welcome back. Today we are starting our unit on social inequality. There we go. And today we're going to start by talking about social class and class inequality. And this is, I think, going to be kind of the foundation of our conversation about inequality and hopefully going to give you guys some building blocks to think about how we talk about class, how we think about inequity in this country. And as you can see from the syllabus, we're going to talk about lots of different forms of inequality, but I think this will be a good starting place for us. So just to quickly talk about the quiz, obviously the quiz is open from today until Friday. You'll have Friday until 11:59 p.m. And after that, the quiz will not be open. And unless for some reason you don't have internet, you got really sick, a family member got really sick, there will be no exceptions to that. So I expect you guys to get it in for 11:59, and that you'll leave yourself enough time that you can take the entire quiz. That being said, if you have any questions, as always, I'm available by email. I'm available in office hours to review material, to hear me kind of teach it again, and to answer your specific questions. And if you haven't seen it already, the assignment description for the quiz is in our files tab, so you can see my advice about how to study and what specifically to expect from the quiz. All right, so all that being said, what are we going to talk about today? Well, of course, we're going to start out by defining what is social class, right? What do we mean when we talk about social class? We're going to think about what social factors determine our class, right, our economic class. As we're going to talk about today, our class is not really something we have much actually choice in or say in. So then we're going to think about what social environmental factors go into determining that. We're going to look at some classical theories that talk about social class and inequality to kind of understand where the discipline started from thinking about that. We're also going to talk about why does class inequality persist over time. If we know that there is deep economic inequality in this country, why is it that it still exists? And we're going to sort of end by talking about how has class inequality gotten worse over time, which is kind of a bummer to end on, but an important point to make here in connection with why class inequality persists. All right, so I should say, just double checking, yes, so there will be 3 parts to this lecture, so make sure that you watch them all, etc. And I should say, just because a lecture has 3 parts doesn't necessarily mean that it's a longer lecture. It just means that I've chosen to break it up in such a way so that you're not getting like half an hour of material at once. All right, so we're going to start off in this part thinking about where social class comes from and what, how we can think about class as a sociological issue and not just an individual one. So I'd like to start off with this quote, tying back to what we learned with C. Wright Mills and the sociological imagination. So this quote says, "Americans are much more comfortable recognizing the power of individual initiative than recognizing the power of social class." Okay, reread it again, pause it if you need to. In essence, what this quote is pointing at is that in America, we don't think about social class or economic class as an issue that could be thought of sociologically, right? We don't employ that sociological imagination to think about social class. Okay, so for example, the pervasive discourse of like the pick yourself up by your bootstraps phrase, right, which indicates that in order to be successful, you just need to be determined, right, and want it enough, okay? The self-made American dream narrative is really prominent, for example. All of these kinds of discourse and narratives emphasize the individual, right, that in order to be successful and rich, all you have to do is want it enough and to work hard enough and apply yourself, and you can rise through the ranks and be upper class and, you know, be a self-made millionaire or billionaire. Okay, so what this quote is pointing at is that there's some sort of issue here that perhaps as Americans we're going about this the wrong way, and we're not actually employing that sociological imagination to think about where social class comes from. This is kind of made worse by all of the self-help narratives that revolve around social class, right? So we have this book here, which is really famous, right, written by Napoleon Hill, called Think and Grow Rich. All right, it's a self-help book for essentially how do you accumulate wealth and rise among the social class ranks. Okay, again, these self-help narratives perpetuate the idea that social class is an individual issue, and that our economic standing in this country is purely self-determined, right? That it's just a matter of willpower and whether we want it and whether we're going about our finances strategically. And then we often see reports like this, right? So even if we're not the people buying self-help books and are maybe, a little bit more savvy and aware of what social class means, we see charts like this, right? For example, which charts the unemployment rate in this country, right? So we see what unemployment looks like over time and as a percentage of the labor force. So this tells us how unemployment looks on a yearly basis and how it changes over time, right? But it actually doesn't tell us so much about social class. What we see here is kind of the overall health of the economy, and we're not so much seeing any data that tells us this about the social forces that determine these rates, right, or the social forces that are constructing social class, okay? So without all of this information, when people see charts like this, often they resort to explanations like, they didn't work hard enough, or they went into the wrong field, where jobs were, think of like the coal mine industry, for example, or lots of people were laid off, that industry is not coming back, right? There's a lot of individual blame put on these people because we're not zooming out and seeing the bigger picture of the social forces that are shaping social class. Okay, so enter sociology and the sociological way of understanding class. So to start off with, when we talk about social class, as many of you kind of know, we toss that phrase around a lot, we're just talking about some division between people in a population that's based on some sort of social and economic status, right? So oftentimes nowadays when we talk about class, we're talking about your income, your personal assets, right? Do you have investments? Do you own a home? And we're also talking about a social status, right? So are you a president? Are you a CEO? That social identity, right, grants you a certain access to a certain social class, right, in addition to your economic standing. So with some of our identities, I will say, let me back up. So the issue of social class, when we think about it from a sociological perspective, is one of an ascribed versus achieved status. Right? So what do I mean by that? Some statuses, some social identities we have are things that we work for and that we earn over time. Okay, and we call those achieved statuses. So, for example, an achieved status might be some sort of merit or title you were given based on hard work. Okay, it could be, for example, the status of a mother or a father. That is a status that you had some sort of choice into, and then maybe you didn't, right? But there were choices that were made that that earned you that status in some way. This is in contrast to what sociologists call ascribed statuses, which are identities and status that we did not necessarily choose, right? And oftentimes that we were born with. So from the second we were in this world, we had that label or that status put upon us for, a myriad of reasons. So, for example, race, ethnicity is a great example of an ascribed status, right? That you're born into this world that already has racial categories it recognizes, that it deems important, right? And so when you're out of the womb, you're either white, you're black, you're Hispanic, you're Asian, you're whatever, right? And you had no choice in that. Same with your gender, right? And that also gets a little more complicated, right, as we consider trans issues as well. Okay. Ability is also an example of ascribed status. So are you able-bodied? Are you disabled in some way, right? There was not a choice made there that influenced that status. So it's not achieved, it's ascribed, it's put upon you. Okay, so particularly in America, we love to think about class as an achieved status, right? So if you think about the American dream, the whole concept behind that is that if you just want it hard enough and you work hard enough, you can achieve the status that you want, right? But that's not quite true, right? And as social scientists, we actually tend to think about social class as something that is ascribed, okay? That's put on us even from birth. We have a social class that's out of our control. Okay, this is because a myriad of social factors influence our social class, or what we call more often our socioeconomic status. Okay, and socioeconomic status is a lot of things combined. It's your economic status, it's dependent on your social identity. Okay, but it's kind of a catch-all term to talk about your place in society and sort of the hierarchy in society. Okay, so then what we might think then, right, leads us to the next question, what are some of the social forces that shape our class that are kind of out of our control? All right, so first of all, the most important one is our parents' class. From the second you're born into a household that makes a particular amount of income, right, that has wealth or assets, okay? And for most of our lives, our parents' class is our class identity as well, right? So if you grew up in a working class household, you were working class, right? And you couldn't make any money, right? And that's your class status, okay? If you're born into an upper class household, you're upper class, right? You're an upper class kid. And what happens, as we see from the data, that this class status actually sticks to you for most of your life. It's actually very difficult to get rid of your parent status and move up into another status. And this is because our parents' class gives us lots of resources, or doesn't give us resources, depending on their standing, right, where they fall. So for example, if you come from an upper class household where you had lots of resources, you were able to engage in extracurricular activities, you could get tutors, you could then go on to a good college, which got you a degree, like a fancy degree, that then got you a good job, which then paid you a lot of money, right? And that's not to say that you can't break out of that cycle at any point. Certainly you can, right? But generally, when we look at the data, what we see is that your parents' class is the biggest determinant in your own class when you grow up. Okay. As I sort of alluded to in that example, education is also a big determinant, right? Were you able to get a really good education that got you a high-paying job? Were you not educated, right? Maybe you had to drop out of high school in order to work and support your family as well. Your race is also a huge determinant, and we're actually going to spend a whole class talking about this, right? When we talk about race, we're going to also talk about how it intersects with social class. Your nativity, are you an immigrant? Were you born here? Okay. Your marital status, are there two incomes in your household? Is there one? Okay. Your health, right? Are you a healthy person that's able to go out and work? Or for whatever reason, do you experience, are you in poor health in some way that might affect your class status? When we talk about education, we're also going to talk about neighborhood a lot. Okay, so where you grow up determines your future class status in some pretty big ways. Okay, and this is largely due to how public schools are funded through taxes. Okay, and so some public schools are really good and have lots of resources, and some public schools are not so good and can't hire great teachers and don't have a lot of resources. And what this means is that the kids in those schools are less likely to go on and get into really great colleges and be prepared, in essence, for that next step. Okay, so that's going to wrap it up for this section. The big takeaways for you guys to take with you into this next section is that social class is not just an individual issue, right? That if we apply that sociological imagination, we start to see that there are other social forces bigger than the individual person that shape our social class, right? That influence our standing in society outside of our control. All right, so in the next section, we're going to start to talk about some of the classical approaches to social class, what classical theorists had to say. And then in the final section, we're going to talk about what the wealth gap in this country actually looks like, okay? And why it persists over time, why those social forces are so powerful, okay? I will see you in the next section.